Welcome to the Untold Tales audio anthology, written by Don Muchow and narrated by Dr. Jeffrey A. Robinson. The Fifth Angel, a story set in William H. Hodgson's Nightland by Don Muchow. Revelations 16:10. Then the fifth angel poured out his bowl, and his kingdom became full of darkness. I shall venture to communicate first to the reader the circumstances that led to my tardy return to earth. As a young man, I remember others placing me in a life pod, a device that resembles the sarcophagi of the long past, capable of supporting and sustaining one for a long journey. I am hopeful that you, dear reader, will find among your records knowledge of such a science. Ages ago, a number of us equal to the population of a small town took leave of our home planet, having sufficient means to construct a vessel for our departure at a time when its population exceeded 40,000 million individuals. We knew our civilization was dying, and a few of us had set out for better futures. Our civilization had not yet lost the level of achievement sufficient to determine the location and distance of several habitable worlds, and reach them within a conceivable interval of time. It was our fervent hope that, traveling at great speed toward the nearest of them, we should move in succession from one to the next, until such time as we had found a new home, or were forced to return. We were forced to use the life pods to conserve resources, and with luck to preserve such life that a few of us pioneers might live to see our new home. By what cause I arrived at this time and place, I am not certain. The little I know is that 17 generations had been born and died by the time I was placed into a life pod, and that the masters of the journey had until then failed to find a suitable place to set down. After 300 years, our supplies must have run low, and we were now of necessity returning. I've often speculated as to the general absence of people when I awakened, and I have been tempted to credit my survival to fortunate location during the period of what happens to have been general starvation and cannibalism. Early on, as I roamed the ship, I observed the smell of decay and noted that many of the life pods bore signs of forced intrusion. It was my exceedingly good fortune to have awakened when the ship was again approaching Earth, and such days had passed. We were supposed to have reached the first of the nearest stars within a single generation, but records of the voyage are, to all appearances, non-existent. I attempted to surmise the interval that had passed since the ship's departure. As a child, I had been educated in the ways of science and mathematics, so I repeated a simple formula in my head that involved the speed of the ship and the number of years that had transpired, by which I might determine the time that had passed on Earth. I determined that we must have reached our first destination in 7 multiples of the time required of a beam of light, meaning our ship was traveling at 92% of that velocity. After 17 generations, considering the effects of relativistic acceleration, 2,000 or 3,000 years should have transpired. I did not expect at this point to find myself able to communicate with the planet's current residents, but I hoped against hope that someone would recognize the approaching craft from preserved records. Upon my return, however, the ether seemed strangely quiet. After some time it occurred to me that in my calculations I had not allowed for time in the life pod, failing to take note that a human generation thus preserved might easily span 300 or even 400 years. I multiplied my answers by a factor of 20, arriving at a date of 60,000 years from my departure. By that reckoning, there was nearly no chance that I would be able to communicate with members of my own species upon returning, but I held closely to the conviction that whatever advanced technology might remain could indeed capture or hail an ark ship streaking across the heavens. I cannot explain the desolate solitude and isolation I felt at this point, for even though I had not yet made land, I was all but certain that human technological civilization had not survived. Nevertheless, I resolved to search for its remains, such as they might be, for if no other reason than to busy myself with tasks and not become lost in thought. The ship hovered for the better part of 3 days in waiting for a landing beacon that would never come. And not finding one, at last, it descended into the darkness of the anti-sunward side, for the moon now lay dim and distant, as if brooding over its brother's own lunacy, and provided very little illumination. Having nothing else to do, I took copious notes, which I leave to you now in the hope that someday someone will stumble upon them and know that our race, or what became of it, did not perish in feral ignominy. Hereupon begins my story. In retrospect, I did not realize the full extent to which Earth had changed. The same face now presented itself constantly to the sun, which I observed by noting that a particular landmark near the daylight terminator never moved into darkness during our descent. Once or twice I thought I observed a blinking or twinkling light just beyond, but I'm convinced now that the source was nothing artificial, perhaps volcanism. The second matter of note was that the water level had dropped severely. What remained of it appeared to be taken up into vast permanent cyclones which churned constantly over areas thousands of miles wide. I tried to orient myself by locating a few more permanent fixtures, such as mountain ranges. To my dismay, I recognized nothing. The ship finally landed in the midst of a vast sloping plain, whose extent was barely discernible in the orange sootiness of the distant moon, a light so weak and distant that it was entirely washed out by the glow from the occasional volcano. I ventured to determine direction, but found it impossible, given the general lack of landmarks and the complete absence of a stable magnetic field. I took time provisioning myself from what little dry food stores remained on board, and gathered equipment for a cold, harsh world of eternal night, taking the most whole and fitting of bodysuits that hung on the racks near the exit, and stuffing my pockets with as many long-lasting light sources as I could find, as well as several devices I thought might prove useful as weapons or tools. One of my first jobs would be to find, slay, and eat a decent meal. After this, I reasoned, I could set my eye on exploring and looking for others. I donned the suit and stepped out, letting my eyes adjust as I took in my surroundings. Downward, the slope continued as far as I could see, eventually ending in a range of low mountains and volcanoes, the tallest of which was bathed in a dim glow near the horizon. Behind me, up the slope, lay a line of black hills, over whose top peered the apex of a bright, silvery structure that ascended into the night. Noting its uniquely synthetic nature, I determined it to be my new destination, and clung to the faint hope of discovering what had happened to humanity in our voyager's absence. I had no choice but to make my way on foot, so I set directly after assuring myself of the security of the ship and of my ability to return and re-enter it. At first, I took great care to trace my path, to attempt to fix my location against some landmark, but after a short while I grew fearful that repeated attempts at summoning light might not only drain my limited power source, but attract unwanted attention to my progress. Ahead was a harsh, wind-blown vista, unlike any I had ever seen. Indeed, it was difficult to recognize as my native Earth. I had seen pictures of my home planet as a child, various and sundry, ranging from verdant fields of vegetation, bedecked with broad swaths of color that swayed and undulated beneath gentle breezes, to jagged spires of olivine thrown up through the bedrock of ancient seas. In every one of 1,000 images lay a splendid beauty and light that bespoke the natural rhythm of a place somehow alive. The scene I now surveyed was dark, sour, and gray, and over it clung the grisly countenance not of death or destruction, but of oblivion. As I cast my eyes ahead to the range of black hills illuminated by a sourceless pallor, I could make out no vegetation, indeed no green thing, nor any evidence that there had ever been such a color. It was as if even memory of it had been forgotten. The incline was so gradual that I did not register my steady progress. However, after what seemed like an eternity, I ventured to direct the light on the way that I had passed. The ship, dark except for a small beacon upon its vast hulk, lay in a background so black and featureless as to render it nearly invisible. I could tell its location only by the manner in which it obstructed the faint, nacreous glow of some distant fire pit. No particular spot on the featureless slope afforded comfort, so after what seemed like an eternity, I chose a boulder of moderate size and flatness, and sat down to rest. Its surface seemed oddly smooth, in places covered with flakes of a dry, pock-marked substance that might equally have been paint or lichen. I picked at a patch of it until I had removed a piece large enough to hold between my fingers and examined further. The rear or underside portion had a texture that, when wet, might be called gummy, had it not become powdery and brittle over eons. With one hand I laid the piece flat on my palm, tilting it slightly to shelter from the brisk, icy wind, in whose grasp small clouds of dust were periodically swept up into eddies. The pattern of chips on the massive rock reminded me of sea coral, but it lacked the frail grace of the animal's perforated skeleton. The patchy incrustation on the rock had a dark brown, rusty, mineral look, and I imagined now and then that I saw a faint sheen of extrudite trailing from a few of them. I desperately wished for a paleontologist, a biologist, for anyone if it must be known. I carefully pocketed the few small flakes, and rose to continue my journey. The mission I had contrived since my awakening had changed several times by now. Initially, I had first intended to establish communications with whatever civilization I might find. Failing that, I had decided to look for the remnants of such in the ruins and monuments, or at worst in the wild outposts of its receding edge. Surely the most stalwart of nations had survived in recognizable form. Now it seemed there was no one and nothing to which to return. I held little hope that the blasted landscape around me was in any way hospitable to the waning dew of life that had so briefly sparkled on the planet's surface. Indeed, I wagered myself lucky to find any remnant at all. I searched, for that is what man does, and yet I was not prepared for what I would find. It was, to my best recollection, 6 days later that I reached the top of the rise, and finally saw from a short distance away the structure, which, for the sake of clarity regarding its appearance, I call the pyramid. The top of the Herculean edifice, of which a part was visible, I had previously scanned across the summit of the Black Hills before I crossed. Its edges were straight, glassine, and razor-sharp. It was doubtless artificial. But was it man-made? By what means and by whose hand it ascended the miles into the heavens is any man's guess. I will perhaps never know, for my attention was drawn at once to the scene surrounding it. About the pyramid, at an unknown distance, lay a great, low, circular wall. It's worth noting here the appearance of the wall. From my vantage point at its base, it seemed to be the remnants of a massive building encircling the pyramid and disappearing into nothingness above. Along its lower edge, from the ground to perhaps 4 or 5 times my height, the wall was utterly featureless and black, except for a thin covering of dust and the lone rod or banister that ran its length as far as the eye could see. The rod stood out from the wall on thick struts, and the body appeared to be some sort of silver metal, perhaps as wide across as my body. There was a peculiar absence of dust within 1 or 2 body lengths of the rod above and below it. On a lark, I got out a simple mechanical compass. When I held the compass flat, it pointed along the circumference of the rod in a nearly straight line parallel to the wall. When I held the compass on its side, the device pointed straight up. So this wall was truly a defense, perhaps humanity's last. Through this massive 30-mile ring had once coursed a magnificent magnetic current, one strong enough to permanently magnetize the rod. For centuries it had perhaps held back the tide of oblivion, and at last it had been broken, and predators had doubtlessly streamed within. If this were a settlement, it had been breached countless ages ago. At the convergence of the roads toward the pyramid were a number of dark hillocks that appeared separate from the underlying stone. I made my way toward them to examine them further. As I walked within their shadow, I felt a preternatural coldness. It was eerily quiet. I chanced lighting one of the electrochemical devices that I'd been saving for the purpose of navigation, in order to hurry down the craggy incline toward the lowland in which the pyramid sat. The light's yellow glare blazed in stark contrast to the bleak vista, and as I moved, it bounced in and out of deeper crevices. I could not help feeling that I was making noise with the light alone. When I reached the bottom of a miles-long steep descent to the edge of the pyramid, feet bruised from the rocks, I leaned exhausted against its outer wall, turned the light off, and rested. Suddenly I awoke, possessed of a strange feeling that I was being watched. I shouldered a long metal rod I had taken from the ship, which I imagined using as a cudgel if necessity arose. I turned and looked at the pyramid, but the sheer, undisturbed walls bespoke no purpose. In frustration, I pounded my fists against the surface, but before I could touch the metal, I was pushed away. I leaned against the building softly, and it admitted my weight. I stepped back and picked up a rock and threw it at the structure. The rock was deflected before striking it. That was why, even when the magnetic current had failed, the pyramid itself had not been disturbed. There would have been no sense in constructing such an elaborate defense for a burial ground, a dump, a museum, or even a weapons cache. But something told me that as oblivion rained down on the protective dome outside, this pyramid had survived a portion of what was left of humankind. It had to be a residence. But was anyone still here? How would I know? What if there had been others? It wasn't too much to imagine that another civilization had arisen from an offshoot clan of outsiders, religious zealots or survivalists, who found life in the pyramid too restrictive when it became crowded. But if not one, but several. What about visitors from another world, who had sought us even as we were seeking them? What would have become of them? Would this have been their residence, while mankind survived in the frigid highlands, or huddled in a cave mouth along the banks of a dark river? The dark mounds gathered near the opening of the pyramid now took on a more sinister appearance. I could not escape the feeling that the door to the pyramid, if indeed it were such, had been surrounded. Maybe in its waning years, humanity had been such a danger to itself that, like a rabid animal, it had been imprisoned and guarded until its demise. Feeling the need to move, I made a slow circuit of the pyramid itself to determine if ingress had been made. That was when I stumbled across a great stone building formed of a rough-hewn rock that stood in contrast to the smooth, silvery pyramid. For reasons that shall become apparent, I chose to call this building the museum, which resembled a giant wedge laid on its side. From the lower end, the roof of the building was visible, and it was apparent that beyond the massive stone and metal assemblage, the center of the structure lay open to the air. It was in this open-air courtyard of the museum that I discovered what I shall call the clock. This structure of stone and gears had miraculously survived the fall of man, or perhaps it had been built afterwards by visitors cataloging what they had found. Even now I still do not know. Nevertheless, along with the pyramid, it stood out, and as I surmised its relative importance, I chose to investigate further. As far as I could tell, the enclosed gallery surrounding the courtyard was some sort of museum. I turned the light back on, and, careful to observe any point of entry, pressed deeper into the interior, tracing a gradually clockwise path past numerous large alcoves set back into the stone behind polished cylindrical columns. As I walked, I shone the light on each side of the alcoves in succession. In one I found what must surely have been a flying ship, for it was metallic and oblong, with some control surfaces I recognized from detailed lessons about the planned return to Earth. However, the markings were in a language I did not recognize. I pressed further, stumbling eventually upon the dust-covered remnants of a display case, now nothing but brittle shards lying in a circle around a second collapsed structure. Beyond this, around a turn to my left, was a long hallway that led toward the outer wall. In this hallway, I found numerous small artifacts, each marked with symbols in the same strange language. In the center of the hallway was a flat table with an assortment of shallow depressions grouped into small collections. At one side of the display sat a pile of smooth, roughly circular stones. I picked up one of the stones and placed it into a depression. As I expected, nothing happened. Then I noticed that around some of the hollows were traced grooves that separated each group from the other. Carved into the flat stone of the table near the same side of each group were symbols. Each group of similar numbers bore the same symbol through an arrangement of depressions which was entirely different. I noticed after a while that there were additional smaller symbols next to the loose, uncircled collections within the larger groups. The smaller symbols always referred to the same number of depressions. Impulsively, I counted them out in my head and marked them in the slanting light by placing some of the smaller stones in each depression. When I stepped back, I realized that the table was a lesson in arithmetic. 2 stones and another 2 stones, each pair marked with the same symbol, were circumscribed and marked with another symbol that obviously meant 4. Other groupings had similar symbols for 10, and several places, instead of hollows, there were groups of engraved symbols for 10, 20, and so forth, on up to numbers that were quite large indeed. I got out my notes and transcribed each symbol and the number it meant, and then went back to the first few displays I had passed. Now the markings made some sort of sense. As far as I could tell, each display was marked with a string of symbols that uniquely identified it. I venture to guess that the race that had erected the museum had a knowledge of place value and wrote down a few of the inscriptions I had seen below when sampling the alcoves. After some time, though, I realized I could make no further sense and moved on. The museum was quite large, and I took copious notes as I went. What was left of the ancient reliquary was indeed revealing, for it seemed to house items of both great age and recency. I recognized fossil remains of Permian reptiles, including one perfectly preserved Dimetrodon, another small flying ship, an assortment of stone axes and tools from the Neolithic age, and a vice called a signator, whose mates I might easily find on my own ship. Next to the Dimetrodon was a number 310, followed by a symbol that looked like the eye of a great storm, but cut in half horizontally. On the axis, the number 14 followed by the same symbol, and on the signator, the number 2. The flying ship bore a much larger number and a different symbology. I felt compelled to return to the clock. I exited the museum and headed toward the courtyard. About a third of the way there, the thick end of a wide black stone wedge rose from the roof, becoming narrower toward the high side of the building. On it were engraved more numbers, and some symbols in what appeared to be a range of 20 or 30 languages. I thought I recognized one of them, though the characters were greatly mutated and primitive and ideographic. Besides some of the words were other symbols that I took to be representations of the sun, moon, a bipedal figure, certain constellations, and other rebuses with no identifiable context. With effort, I pieced together what I could, and it said this: "This device, man building 2,102 circles. Man, this building, weapon, 28 swirl." There were few interpretations that made any sense, and after several unfruitful attempts at translation, I moved up the incline toward the mass of stone, metal, and what appeared to be machinery, resolving to return to the inscriptions when it was possible to make more sense of them. Presently I came upon a place from which I could observe an open space in the interior of the assembly. At the far end, through a cage-like metal structure that speared and connected several boulder-like objects as large as a man, was what appeared to be a door. In the dim light coming from high up on the pyramid, it was possible to make out the machine's features, and owing to the narrowness of the space between the stones, I stored my light and squeezed through an open space at the very center, then onward through the door at the far side. On the far side was a little room, on whose near wall was displayed a miniature image of the machine and its symbols. On each of the 5 circles that I took to represent the man-sized stones outside was a symbol. 2 of the symbols were worn to the point of unreadability, but I could make out one stone for each of the moon and the sun, and another that simply displayed a small circle moving around a larger circle. Curious, I went outside to compare what I had seen with the actual structure. Indeed, on the inner face of each stone was a symbol that matched the image in this small room. This time I could see a 4th image displayed, and what looked like a 2-tailed fish or a storm, a circle with several curving lines emanating out of it in a spiral, but divided in half by a straight line. I was in the center of the circle when the sunstone moved. It's more accurate to say that the stone, which merely sat at the end of the longest of several arms, changed its position a hand's breadth, but the mere movement stunned me. For an instant, I feared the structure would collapse on me and drop me unceremoniously into a chamber beneath. However, after a considerable pause, nothing further happened. When the opportunity presented itself, I escaped the circle of moving stones and exited again to the sloping roof. It was then that I noticed the additional inscriptions around the rim of the great black wedge near the top. The entire perimeter of the wedge was inscribed with vertical marks at regular intervals, or nearly so, except for a brief interruption on one side that seemed to be a table for unit conversion. For instance, it appeared that 52 suns comprised a moon, 7 moons a full circle. The 1 million symbol plus 2 circles equaled half a storm, and 250 half storms equaled a storm. As to the remainder, above each mark was a number, and above some of the marks were man-sized stones, one of which had just moved. In my estimation, the stones were intended to move in a circle, pointing at different times to different positions along the wedge. I took out my notes on the museum collection and turned on the light. I read slowly. Dimetrodon 310 half storm, which I had noted somewhere was also recorded as storm 60 half storm. Stone Age 14 half storm. Signator 2 half storm. Flying ship 400,000 symbol plus 2 circles. In my light-headed state, I ran excitedly through the other wings of the museum, checking my theory against the display. The numbers were dates. It took me considerable time to arrive at a straight system of reckoning, but I had artifacts as a baseline, including one from my own time, and after a short while I learned that one of the additional symbols I had skipped probably indicated positive and another one, or its absence, negative. What remained was to make another assay, now to observe the positions of the stones and the metal arms on the device in the courtyard. As I've said before, I had determined it to be a clock, and indeed it was. After reasoning that with direction of motion was most likely positive, I reread the number on the clock. 41,000 half storm, 210,000, 715 two circle, 4 moon, 5 sun. If my conversions were correct, the number was 41,210,715, followed by 4 moons, 5 suns. It's well known that the species Dimetrodon walked the earth in the late Paleozoic, during a period once referred to as the Permian, almost exactly 290 million years ago. Since landing, I've thought long upon the facts I did not want to acknowledge, manufacturing alternate explanations for over a week while I consume the ship's remaining food and energy. And so, most gracious reader, it is by this route that I have led you, whoever you might be, to judge for yourselves before I set out on this my final journey, mankind's final journey on earth. It is without a doubt that I had arrived long past the year 60,000, long past the age of great archaeologies noted in the museum. I have arrived long past even the epoch of predation, the cataclysm, and the final destruction of civilization that the historian X, whose notes have proved so useful in my despair, foretold in the waning years of the light. Whether there are still any humped men or things that peer, I cannot say. Whether laughter still comes from the hills to the distant east, I do not know, nor do I any longer care to know. A once famous author said that to each man is given his own private heaven or hell, and indeed, what manner of things may have transpired to this end will remain the job of some future archaeologist amongst races unknown to us. Maybe one day they will happen on the ghostly hulk of our solar system as it drifts through the constellation Hercules. I know that dim hallux I saw against the pyramid were sentient beings called Watchers, whose race waited for the fall and fed upon the last remnants of men, and who are no longer a menace now that their food source has disappeared and driven them to extinction. Soon I will travel to the summit of the pyramid to die in peace while there is still light. I have left behind the last vestiges of hope, and I cannot bear returning to my ship. It is with heavy heart that I place one step before the next. To what end, I ask, and no one answers, and no one ever will. For I have survived the extinction of my species alone in the year 41,210,715, at a time when no living thing save myself crawls this dark and wretched earth. Thank you for listening. As you know by now, we love our listeners, fans, patrons, and supporters. Please let us know what you think of our podcast and our stories. The best way to do that is to subscribe to our podcast at untold-tales.com. By doing so, you'll be added to our mailing list so you can be notified of upcoming episodes, blogs, and other information.